Hello, everybody. It seems that we are live. Good morning to one and all. Welcome to the first ever Sporecast called Community Protect Thyself. This is a program about security culture and risk reduction in psychedelic communities. I'm so fortunate to be here with you all. Thank you to everyone who is watching from home right now. I want to introduce myself and give a little context first before I introduce these lovely panelists that we are joined by. My name is Caroline Savory, and I'm the Executive Director of Society for Psychedelic Outreach, Reform, and Education, aka SPORE. We are a Colorado-focused organization based in Denver, and I want to take this opportune moment to share with everybody our new mission statement. SPORE's mission is to build community sovereignty through cultivating diverse leadership, cooperative education, and deeply networked communities towards respectfully and responsibly integrating psychedelics into our society. I am so fortunate today to be hosting this epic conversation all about creating safer practices and norms in psychedelic communities so that we can carry on and expand the momentum that we have happening in our communities. SPORE stands in solidarity with communities everywhere who are organizing for the decriminalization of plant-based entheogenic medicines and who are demanding responsible community-based access and healing models. There are many different kinds of entheogens, also known as psychedelics, out there, some of which are inaccurately, but officially classified as Schedule I drugs by the Controlled Substances Act, which means they're defined as drugs that have no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Of course, we feel that this is wrong and we work to reverse it. But in the process of doing this work, people in our communities are at some risk of being targeted for state persecution and violence. We have observed this to be a big concern and issue in the communities that we serve. On one hand, we see people that are practicing fairly unsafe behaviors in terms of like how they speak about this work. And on the other hand, we are also encountering people who have perhaps exaggerated fears about what could happen to them. And so they're not willing to show any kind of visible support for psychedelics at all. So we're hoping that today's conversation, which will feature the insights and diverse perspectives of those who we have in our community, will help illuminate various angles to these questions of how do we build a culture that truly protects and normalizes safer practices when it comes to organizing around psychedelics. So I'm so privileged today to be joined by this amazing panel of guest speakers that I'd love to introduce you to now. With us today, we have Courtney Barnes. She is a lawyer and passionate drug policy reform advocate, founding partner at Barnes Kaplan LLP, a boutique law firm and policy firm, and serves as the general counsel for SPORE. She's also a state policy advisor for Decriminalized Nature and sits on the advisory board for Heroic Hearts Project, Inc. And she was involved in the development of the Oakland Community Health Initiative, or OCHI, framework. Welcome, Courtney. We also have Deacon Rada with us. Deacon is a self-taught and practicing economist and hermeticist, a second-degree black belt in Kurai Katori Ninjutsu, and an engaged theorist and educator on matters of community sovereignty and defense. And Deacon is based in Denver. Welcome, Deacon. We also have from Denver, Travis Fluck. Travis describes himself as a casualty of the drug war, but fortunately over the years, Travis has gained the tools and platform to influence for systemic change and work toward a ceasefire of the drug war. He has served as the field director for the Denver Psilocybin Initiative and co-founder of the Denver Mushroom Cooperative. Travis has served as his community as a steward and community facilitator. We're so lucky to have you, Travis, and to hear from you about your experiences. Thanks for being here. Welcome, Travis. And we're so pleased to be uplifting some of our local, community resources here, but we additionally have some very special guests from all the way over in California who've made the time to be here with us and to share their wisdom with the broader community. La Pachamami, also known as Paula. I might say your name is Paula during this broadcast. Paula is a performance artist and movement strategist working at the intersections of Indigenous rights, racial justice, cultural preservation, migrant and environmental justice, drug policy, feminism, historical memory, healing justice, decarceration, and demilitarization. Ooh, we are so lucky to hear from you today, La Pachamami. By day, La Pachamami collaboratively builds feminist abolition, freedom of movement, and genocide intervention movements. And by eve, they immerse themselves in sound and movement healing to decompress, and they are based in LA. Thank you so much for being here, Paula. Welcome. And last but by no means least, we have Aize. Aize is a writer, educator, guerrilla theologian, and Afrofuturist. He is currently heading the Tupac Amaru Shakur Foundation's Mutulu Shakur Initiative for Alternative Medicine, exploring the ways in which psychedelics can be used to improve the mental health of poor people and people of color. And he's been working in psychedelic spaces as a therapist and as an author since 2004, and he lives in the Bay Area. Welcome, everyone. We have such an incredible panel, and we're going to really explore so many different aspects of these questions about security culture, protection, what does protection mean in these contexts? And we hope that this recording will be a resource for everyone in our communities. For folks who are watching live, thank you. Paula, I'm so sorry. I've been saying La Pachamami's name wrong, it's Paula. For folks who are watching live and you want to comment, if you're watching on Facebook, if you're watching on YouTube or LinkedIn, go ahead and give us some comments if you have questions that come up during this panel. And we will be happy to share your questions with these panelists. We're going to have each person speak for a few minutes to kind of give their perspective on these topics. And then we will have a question and answer session toward the end of this 90 minutes together. So go ahead and enter your questions into the comments, and we will be tracking them on social media and incorporating them. All right, let's kick it off. First, we're going to hand it over to Courtney. Courtney, as our resident lawyer on this panel, we want you to speak first to kind of give us some context for these questions about risk. Would you please orient us to the landscape of risks and dangers and threats facing those who are operating in psychedelic community spaces?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me, Caroline. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. As you correctly, I think it's helpful to start with sort of the big picture, just regulatory landscape with respect to controlled substances. So as you mentioned in the introduction of this forecast, at the federal level, we have the Federal Controlled Substances Act, and that is the primary body of law that is responsible for regulating the production of controlled substances or drugs. The CSA, or the Controlled Substances Act, classifies drugs into 5 schedules based on their potential for abuse, medical value, addiction potential, safety, etc. And currently, we have all hallucinogenic compounds as they're categorized, psychedelics, DMT, ibogaine, psilocybin, psilocin, LSD are all classified as Schedule 1 controlled substances, which is the most restrictive. So as you absolutely mentioned, this means that the federal government believes that these substances have a high potential for abuse, no accepted medical value in treatment in the United States, a lack of accepted safety for use under medical supervision, and essentially the federal government takes the position that Schedule 1 controlled substances may not legally be produced or sold for commercial purposes. Each state has implemented its own version of the Controlled Substances Act. So we have 2 levels of drug regulation, and almost every state in the country, if not every state besides Oregon, classifies psychedelics, and actually Oregon still does classify them as a Schedule I controlled substance, but criminalizes the production, sale, and use of psychedelics at the state level as well. Now we have this beautiful policy reform movement happening where we're seeing local and state governments introduce legislation to decriminalize or remove the criminal penalties associated with certain activities involving psychedelics. But in our current state of the law, these substances are illegal, and engaging in activities with these substances can subject you to significant criminal penalties, including years of jail time, as well as civil forfeiture and other ancillary consequences. So we have to balance this movement of pushing for reform, knowing that these compounds do have medical value, that they have the potential to really, save humanity and can be used safely and do not have addiction potential, and all of these sort of factors that we're having to prove to the federal government. Advocates are in a delicate position in that we are fighting for reform in an area of law where there is significant risk of exposure still. And while the big risks associated with advocacy are not necessarily actually being in possession of psilocybin mushrooms, for example, or manufacturing, us using our platform to educate the community is more of a speech-based advocacy approach, as opposed to, distribution or providing supply to these substances. There are a variety of criminal prohibitions associated with facilitating illegal activity that advocates need to understand how to walk that line carefully. And primarily the big ones are aiding and abetting a controlled substance violation, conspiracy to commit a controlled substance violation, and sort of that attempt statute. And so these crimes under federal and state law prohibit activity where the individual is intending to promote the use or engagement in illegal activity. So, for example, if you were to, provide a how-to book on how to create LSD and how to evade law enforcement and how to sort of do what you want in an illegal capacity under the radar, that could be something that would put you at risk of criminal prosecution or at least investigation. And while the cases that we've seen on this subject are pretty egregious, as I mentioned, essentially how to guide, and you are getting paid on behalf of people engaging in illegal activity on your instruction or guidance. We want to be really careful about our role in the community, in educating the community about the benefits and uses and importance of enacting drug policy reform, while understanding that you are putting yourself in the spotlight as an advocate in a currently still sort of illegal area of law. So it absolutely can be done safely and lawfully. We have the protection of the freedom of speech to express our opinions, to advocate for conduct that may not be popular or accepted by the public. But we want to ensure that, and this is why this forecast is so important, I believe, that advocates understand the risks associated with putting themselves on a public platform, advocating for something, for reform in a space where conduct is still unlawful.
Courtney, thank you. I was wondering if you could share with us in the next few minutes any advice you have for community members in this space and how they can practice safer communications and safer behaviors.
Absolutely. So, as I mentioned, you have the strong undercurrent of freedom of speech, but when you're advocating for policy reform, you want to be very cognizant of your personal and public activities. So this means not carrying controlled substances on your person while you are engaging in advocacy, or being careful about being in possession of controlled substances. You want to also be careful that you are educating your community on the fact that while we believe that these substances should be lawful and we are fighting every day to get to a point in society where that is the case, these substances are still unlawful. And it's really important for you to understand the laws that apply in your community and ensure that you're balancing your support and expression of, affinity for these compounds with also disclaiming the fact that you are not aiding and abetting, or you're not promoting this unlawful activity. We are promoting laws to be changed so that this activity is lawful. So the big things are, understanding that your public role necessarily puts you in the spotlight from a law enforcement standpoint, and knowing that, you have a huge responsibility to serve as a thoughtful and responsible advocate, and that your behaviors are going to influence others, and to ensure that your behavior reflects the behavior that you'd like to influence, which is education, advocacy, change, and responsible use and regulation. And also just, understanding that your public position, whether it's on social media, whether it's with your friends at a concert, whether, it's at home in private with your children or at your job, that there can still be negative implications. We're still seeing people lose jobs for admitting to cannabis use, and people were losing, there's child custody issues if you get into a divorce situation and they're able to bring up bad behavior and what they deem it to be. And so I think it's so important that we authentically support this movement, and that we need courageous advocates like ourselves and everyone listening, and those that are going out into the community and really pushing forward this movement. But just to understand the, responsibility that you have as an advocate in this sort of interim time before we have a society that we'd like to create based on decriminalization and legalization, and know that there are still risks associated with engaging in advocacy related to areas of law that are still in need of reform. So I would say the big things are, educating your community and whoever you talk to that these substances are still illegal, and that you cannot engage in any activity you'd like with psychedelics, and there is risk of prosecution. Knowing that your private and public behavior, thinking about the different ways it can be interpreted by people that you engage with, and ensuring that you're providing the right information so that it can't be skewed in a way that could put you at risk or sort of exposure of engaging in illegal activity. And then also just really taking your position and responsibility as an advocate very seriously, and know that you are doing incredibly important work, but that we're doing this work because there's still a ton of work to be done.
Thank you so much, Courtney. It's really powerful to hear about the implications for advocates who are publicly visible in this space of promoting the change in laws. Something that we must acknowledge is that the communities that we are supporting today, while the laws are what they are, many of them are creating medicines, sharing medicines in an underground way. For many of us, the access to the medicine itself, in a sense, cannot wait. That's just a reality that we're dealing with. I don't think it's scandalous to acknowledge that there is some underground realities here. And so with that, I want to continue to focus on these questions of kind of security, sovereignty, safety, safer practices in this space. And so I'm going to be handing it off now to Deacon, Deacon Rada. Deacon, as a longtime community organizer and as a community sovereignty design strategist, I'm sure that you're very familiar with some of the common do's and don'ts that you hear about, such as, protect yourself by don't talk to the cops, right? But what I'd like to hear from you is if there's some stuff that people most often seem to overlook or miss about community security practices. What do people often get wrong or misunderstand or misinterpret when it comes to looking at community security?
Yes, thank you. Am I coming through? Looks like I'm coming through. Yeah, I want to talk about this, these things that people kind of mess up. And I want to preface this with a little bit of a disclaimer. And that is that the things I'm going to share are concerning a type of conflict that is the securing a community conflict. Everything has an absolute truth and a relative truth. And in relationship to conflict, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about these things in relationship to conflict. And that makes them a little bit different than how we might think of some of these ideas in other contexts. Can everybody see my screen? Is that coming through? No? Hey, Duffmeister, I think you're working the 1s and 2s. There we go. Excellent. All right. So, as Caroline stated, talking about securing a community, securing a little alcove of society, we have some very special concerns that take us outside of our comfort zone. The first thing is that people want to go with their gut and not feel like they need to learn new stuff. So you have to go out and learn what is outside of your domain of knowledge. So that means that you've got to be willing to actually go out and hit the books. Sorry. So this slide, every ambition, risk, and venture that may face opposition merits careful consideration. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that whatever you do that you really want to work, it's worth reading a few books about. It's worth really thinking about and talking deeply with the people you trust about before you really get into it. Start with a gap analysis. I know gap analyses seem super stuffy and business-like, but for real, do one. That's one of those things. I'm not going to go into how to do a gap analysis, but it's a simple process, a step-by-step process for figuring out where you are, where you want to be, and what's in the middle that's holding you back. And then after you do that gap analysis, it's not a matter of just sitting around and thinking about what the gap analysis showed you. You have to hit the books. This is the thing I was saying before. You've got to go and look at history and say, oh, okay, so we're doing something that is in this kind of like space. I'm not going to talk about any specific thing. You know, as Courtney pointed out, like we don't necessarily want to advocate for any specific thing, but you know, like we're trying to achieve something, and other people have done this in history. Read about those people. You will get so many ideas by looking at exactly specifically what other people have done, and what they did to cultivate themselves. Don't only look at people you identify with, or even limit your review to people you like. You're surveying skill types and examples of success, not deciding how you will live. So research is not about decision making. Put all of your biases aside when you try to learn from examples, and that opens you up to exploring examples of even the opposition. The principles that govern success and failure in any given type of pursuit have remained unchanged for unknowable thousands of years. They aren't changing now. This is one of those things people a lot of times look for the newest, slickest thing. The fact of the matter is the bedrock of security and safety and sovereignty, those habits, those principles, those character traits are not changing. You know, so look at what is unchanging and build your foundation there. Number 2 is develop the skills to meet your goals. So all of that first step is about actually learning and understanding what actually goes in to becoming safe and sovereign, like securing your community, all those things. You have to learn it, but then you actually have to train and develop. So the studying and training are 2 separate things. And so this is about practicing. This is one of the hardest things, I think, for a lot of people to get, because it feels wrong to a lot of communities. But you've got to, at least in this context, eliminate all entitlement and exceptionalism from your thinking. And the simplest way to do that is to watch your speech and correct yourself. It takes a long time, and also to watch your like media diet, like who's influencing you. You know, is it a lot of like entitled thinking that is influencing you? Because entitled thinking will lose fights. If you're not in a conflict, you can afford to be a little entitled, maybe. But if you are entering into a field of conflict, entitlement and exceptionalism, thinking that your case is different, will get you a loss every time. So beliefs like, I didn't do anything wrong, I don't deserve to get arrested, hit, shot, sent to prison, we should all be on the same side. You know, these are the kinds of thinking. That last one's very exceptional, and the first 2 are more entitlement based. Any of these things can happen to you if you put yourself into a conflict with people who do these things. Even if you are right to put yourself into that conflict, these things can still happen, and reality doesn't necessarily care. And so that's one of the hardest truths to realize, is that if you're trying to succeed in reality, you have to think like reality, which is the things that can happen to you can happen to you. Make the safety of your community your responsibility, rather than thinking of the dangers facing your community as someone else's failing. So this means don't blame the cops. They're doing what they think is best. Don't blame the feds. They're doing what they think is, don't blame the legislatures. They're doing what they think is best. You also are doing what you think is best. And you have to recognize that you are a part of this dialectic with all of these people and your collaborators, and spend more time thinking about how you can secure your community than what somebody else should do. Because if you're in a conflict with somebody and you're thinking about what they should do and they're thinking about what you will do, you're going to lose. So think about what they will do and not what they should do. Number 3 is the nature of the game trumps the rules of the game. This is always true. The nature of the game trumps the rules of the game. Know your legal rights, but never think of them as real or inalienable. The idea that we have inalienable rights, that was politicians being politician-y a long time ago and still today. In nature, there are no inalienable rights except like the right to die. That's the only inalienable right that people have or anything has. Everything else is made up of their gifts that we give to each other, and it's good. We should give each other these gifts of rights and community, but you have to recognize that they are man-made and they're fungible. And if you lean on them too hard, you lose. Police policy is less reliable than human psychology. This is that person-first thinking applied in the other direction. Cops are people first, not people are cops first. Cops are people first, right? So when you're looking at like what the cops are going to do or what they should do, or trying to, if you're in a sticky situation, recognize, that cop may or may not follow their rules, but they're still a person, and they still they have the same incentive patterns and points of leverage as every other person. Knowing what the laws say is less predictive than knowing how they've historically been enforced. So a great example of this is the urban camping ban, right? So in Denver, we have this awful law. It's, says basically you can't lay down in a park. It gets selectively enforced. It also never leads to arrests. And the reason nobody gets arrested for it is because it's an incredibly unconstitutional law. So they never want to see it inside court. So what do? They use it as an excuse to move people on. It's the same thing with drugs. Like the way the law reads on the books is not necessarily how it gets enforced, especially across different communities. So knowing how a law gets enforced historically is more important than knowing what the law is. Become aware of all major threats is number 4. Keep local, state, and federal laws in mind. Denver is dotted with all sorts of state and federal properties and jurisdictions, not to mention being oddly shaped. You can actually drive in a straight line straight out of Denver, back into Denver, and then out of Denver again. Like, it is a weirdly shaped thing. So if we're looking at these laws, like, oh, Denver cops can't, spend time or money enforcing psilocybin charges. Like, well, guess what? You might not be in Denver if you're on a rare campus, or even if you're like in parts of downtown, because there's a big chunk of downtown that's federal. Like, you got to recognize that you could be at the post office, which is a federal property, and run into a cop that has, is not limited by any Denver laws. So keep that in mind. Intelligence professionals gather a lot more soft evidence than hard evidence. So that earlier, we're talking about the actual hard legal facts. Courtney was reminding everyone that, advocacy, there are specific things that are against the law. Well, people that are intelligence professionals, and this includes detectives, they spend a lot more time gathering soft evidence that leads them to hard evidence. So even if you're not personally doing anything illegal or even advocating anything illegal, you can still be the hub of a major investigation and be leading, people to all sorts of arrests because, you're going to be more lax because you're not breaking any laws. This is a quote: "The primary work of the intelligence agency should occur during the preparatory phase. At this time, the movements are most vulnerable. They have not experienced a high degree of repression. They consider talk of security as mere paranoia, and they are not breaking laws. They believe that it is safe to organize completely openly. The intelligence agency is therefore able to exploit these conditions and develop detailed dossiers on a wide range of people. The information will be extremely valuable to them later on." That's from a British intelligence specialist advising, counter movement strategy in England. Keep your friends close. Don't keep your enemies closer. That's freaky creeper advice. I think everybody's heard that. Keep your friends close, but keep your enemies, closer. Like, that's for social climbers and like Iago types. Like, understand your enemies. That was point 4. Like, understand what you're dealing with, but don't try to get in bed with your enemies, but keep your friends much, much closer. Know the geometric stability of your network and work to improve it. This one's a little bit heady, but I got a picture here. This is a weak network. You see any individual node, knows maybe a few other nodes, but those nodes don't necessarily know each other. This is that same set of nodes. They haven't moved at all, but the only thing that's changed here, you can see they're like geometric, like 3-dimensional structure is starting to form. It looks really solid. The only difference is that any node in this diagram is more likely to be connected to nodes, to mutual friends, basically. So here, this is weakness, when people don't have a lot of mutual friends and they just have, live in a loose affiliated network, and this is strength. I've got like a 2-hour class on network dynamics. So that was just like a really, really brief thing, but that recording's available if people want it. Don't make your movement values or your personal values about psychedelics. So don't trust people based on the fact that they use psychedelics or that you use psychedelics with them or any other thing. Don't trust people based on identity. Don't trust people based on anything that they can slap on a bumper sticker or that they look like. Center your values on moral virtue and judge people based on character. That's going to keep you safer than a lot of things. If you just follow this one thing and trust people based on what they do and what they do consistently, you'll have better outcomes. So this is the recap. Learn what you don't know. Match your personal development to your goals. The game is greater than the rules. Know the opposition and keep your friends close. And that's all I got. I do this stuff all the time, lead lots of talks. I'm on Patreon as Squiggles, and I'm done.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Deacon. Yes. Wow. That final point, especially of really the power of deep relationships and interrelationships within the network and the strength of observing what people actually do as the basis for whether to trust them and whether to build rapport with them. That really resonates. And it's, I think a part of what SPORE is working to build is more and more interconnected networks, more and more resilient communities. Thank you so much. Now I'd like to pass it on to Travis. Travis Fluck. Wow, you, Travis, have been involved in all parts of this world, right? Of psychedelic advocacy and organizing and activity in this space from a very young age. So I'm wondering, Travis, what can you share with us about what you've learned from your experiences on how to organize community around psychedelics in safer or more protected ways?
Hi. So most of the things that I discuss in the here and now are around harm reduction and benefit maximization, and it's sad that we have inherited a lot of misinformation and stigma that we now have to interrupt and redirect, but it also gives us an opportunity to put a fresh feel on what these substances are and what they can contribute to society versus how they break society down. And fortunately or unfortunately, I have had encounters with law enforcement that I know are traumatic in nature, and they now inform my current day advocacy so that I can spare others, or hope to spare others, the trauma of being arrested, being humiliated, and taking away options for the rest of their lives. I was the field organizer for the decriminalized effort, or the psilocybin decriminalized effort in Denver. And while I was petitioning, somebody casually walked by and said, well, who gets arrested for mushrooms anyway? And it's really interesting because I had never brought my history into my advocate or activist space until that moment. And when I was, I think I was 20 years old, there was a warrant served in my house, and they discovered that I had small mason jars that were colonizing mycelium. And they took those mason jars and gave them to an FBI lab technician. And 3 weeks later, they produced mushrooms from my cultures. And at that point, they charged me with manufacture or attempt to manufacture a controlled substance. So the 12 small mason jars that were taken from my house, once the media got a hold of it, the district attorney said that my setup was generating $10,000 a month, and that I was growing drugs that had no therapeutic value and that could kill people. So that is the stigma, or that is the story that followed me around most of my adult life until I joined the conversation in the decriminalization effort in Denver. And once I was able to inform my activism with my history, it really became a personal quest to provide people with the tools and the information to defend themselves and be very cautious in the space, given that the laws are set up to have a lot of leverage against us and our freedom. So I would say that most of my time, I've been working on this cooperative concept where the community can have an equitable say in the conversation around how do we reintegrate these substances and how do we interface with the capitalist kind of lens that most of society wants to take these substances along that path. So yeah, I talk a lot about equity and a lot about the data that science has, thankfully been providing the last 20 years. Institutions like Johns Hopkins add a lot of provenance to the conversation, because if they have been fruitfully studying this stuff for 20 years, then there must be something to this. And fortunately, the FDA has also come out and said that this is a breakthrough therapy status. And we also have well-respected journalists like Michael Pollan entering into the conversation that these substances have been misconstrued, like we don't really understand them. And with science and safety in mind, we can come to a consensus on how to fruitfully use these substances. And then the last really cool thing that came into the mix a few years ago is that the UN has come out and they have an opinion that we should be decriminalizing all substances. So I am, fortunately, I have those larger, more respected voices to kind of alley-oop into the conversation, that it's not necessarily about my opinion or the anecdotal data that I've come across, that there's real hard facts here to lean on, and guiding people to the information and then showing them how to interface with their communities and share this beneficial information that is backed in science. That's the safest way that I can conduct myself in the current legal landscape.
Thank you. You mentioned your work briefly with Denver Mushroom Cooperative. I would love to hear from you about kind of, I know that you've had a lot of chance to rehearse some responses to people who approach Denver Mushroom Cooperative, right, from a standpoint of like, hey, can I buy mushrooms here, right? Can you speak a little bit about how the DMC is working to protect itself in terms of how it's doing this organizing in this space?
So we've come up with kind of, and it stinks to say it this way, but canned responses. You know, that when people come to us for sourcing, we just keep reiterating like that this stuff is, federally illegal, and that the measures that we've been able to pass in Denver don't protect ultimately, but provide I'll say a toehold in a seemingly unforgiving cultural landscape, so that there's, that people, one of the cool things about the decriminalization effort is that we've created access through cultivation. So There are plenty of resources online that we don't have to be the primary place where people are getting this information, that we can just direct people to time-honored places where information is readily available. And one of the cool things about the Mushroom Cooperative is reminding people that all mushrooms are magical, and that it's not limited to one species, and that a lot of the techniques and ways to produce gourmet and medicinal mushrooms are adaptable to almost all mushroom species. So between, you know, the canned responses and the kind of like broader brushstrokes that we communicate to people, it's not up to us to tell people that this is for them or necessarily how to do this, but how to get in touch with great resources.
Awesome. Thank you, Travis.
Yeah.
All right, this time I'm gonna pass it over to hear from Paola La Pachamami. As a movement strategist who's avid about studying history for insights into today's issues, I'm wondering if you could speak with us about how history can inform questions of security and design in today's psychedelic movements.
Thank you so much, Caroline, and I'm so grateful to be in dialogue with you all today. So for me, it's really vital that we all educate ourselves and do our homework. Much like Deacon said, we need to know why we arrived into the present, where folks are being pipelined into mass incarceration, mass deportation, and subject to the violence of the global arms trade. And it very much has everything to do on the foundations of the global economy, as well as the United States of America. And so I want to take us back to the late 15th century and the early 16th century, when there was mass extermination campaigns in Europe. There was extermination campaigns of femicides, of witches, medicinal doctors who harnessed the power of nature and were very well knowledgeable of the ecosystems and how different plants and different medicines could be used to heal. And that was done during the time of the Inquisition, when religion was manipulated to justify the targeting of people who had social power, the healers who had social power. And that really set the precedent as contact was being made between civilizations, European civilizations in territories that were colonized by European imperial powers. So I'm starting us out here because I think it's so important to ground us in what has happened, because sometimes we default to what has been normalized in our bodies and in society, what has become normal for us on the daily, and we forget. It's historical amnesia, and it's very much designed that way so that we're kind of disoriented when navigating issues around empowering ourselves to access what is healing to us, what is pleasurable to us. So talking a little bit about the witch hunts is important, because that also was running parallel to the campaigns of colonization in Abya Yala, in Africa, in parts of Asia, and really set the foundation for the system of drug control on a planetary level. So I think moving fast forward to the late 19th century, so that would be the late 1800s, I really want to highlight that the creation of drug laws always ran parallel to the control of people's freedom of movement, or the disregard for people's freedom of movement. So even though Chinese laborers were forced to migrate to the United States to build a transcontinental railroad, they were also subject to racist laws, and there was caricatures and propaganda that was created to induce fear-mongering propaganda to target Asian communities. And this was running parallel to the Chinese Exclusion Acts and was portraying Chinese laborers and Chinese community members as folks that were luring white women into opium dens. And this was really the beginning of global drug control schemes. So really an important marker for us to self-educate ourselves more. Later on, very politically and racist, eugenicist motivated approaches to propaganda around cannabis and propaganda around cocaine, again, having a lot to do with the threat of interracial communities flourishing. For example, at jazz clubs in New York, where folks were going to jazz concerts and dancing to jazz music together and smoking weed together. And it was threatening for the eugenicists that were fearful and phobic of interracial relationships leading to mixed offspring. So I'll pause there. I could continue talking. If folks are really digging the history, I'm more than happy to continue talking about it, but I'll just pause there.
Thank you. Wow, those are such important stories to be aware of, histories to be aware of today. And I'd love if you could speak a little bit about how these issues specifically impact the migrant justice movements. I'd love if you could speak about the intersections between migrant justice, drug policy, and community safety.
Yes, thank you so much for asking. So, yeah, again, I'm going to take us a little back into history, but it'll be all relevant. So fast forward to the late 50s, Robert Gordon Wasson travels to Huautla de Jimenez after learning about an indigenous mushroom cult that performs ceremonies with mushrooms. These are sacred ceremonies that have been kept underground for centuries. During those campaigns of colonization, they were protected from being obliterated. And, Robert Gordon Wasson travels with his partner to Huautla. They lie to Maria Sabina, mushroom priestess, in order to access those ceremonies, and then document her in the middle of those ceremonies and publish documentation of those ceremonies in Life magazine without her consent. This leads to psychedelic tourism in Huautla de Jimenez, which has social and lethal consequences for Maria Sabina's family. For her, one of her family members is killed, her house is burned down, and she ultimately dies in destitution. So really important to highlight the harm that happened in exposing this, these indigenous sacred ceremonies. And it also exposed the world to the power and the healing of psilocybin. And so just naming that, because that also plays a pivotal role in advancing the movement for the peace movement, the Black Power movement. And so in the 1970s, Richard Nixon wages a war on the hippies and Black people because they're rising up together against the militarization of the planet, which is a legacy of colonialism and of the witch hunting that happened in Europe. So just like tracing all of these threads is so important for our movement, knowing where we've been and orienting ourselves in those histories. So the attack on the countercultural revolutions of the mid-20th century lead us to the expansion of incarceration in the later parts of the 20th century. And this is all happening while the US is backing dictatorships all over the world. And so that backing of dictatorships coming here from the center of empire lead to forced migration from all of these countries where the US is sending military aid and backing mass acts of mass atrocity. And so towards the 80s, there's an expansion of the private prison industry. So there's more prisons that are being built, but around, the 90s, there's the numbers of people that are being put in, that are incarcerated in these prisons starts to decrease. Sure, there was like a lot of increase in the populations during the 80s because of the war on Black communities with crack cocaine. But in the 90s, the numbers start to go down. So there needs to be a new precedent for the expansion again. And so with changing of immigration laws in 1996, the war on terror, the foundation of ICE shortly after the war on terror, and then the war on drugs a few years later, it all happens within the same 5-10 years. And this sets the precedent for a system of mass incarceration and mass deportation of immigrants. So I know I'm running a little low on time, but I just really want to emphasize that folks who are undocumented, who are legal permanent residents, if found to be in violation of drug laws, there can be grave consequences with immigration status. So folks can be subject to mandatory detention. Folks can be deported. There are some legal avenues for defending oneself, but I think we should all be working towards the abolition of the mass incarceration of immigrants and mass incarceration in general. As I mentioned before, I'm not sure if I had opened with this, but there's a saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I really think we're in this moment where we can't betray each other as we have in previous lifetimes. We must do this together. And if we're really surrendering to the psychedelic experience, we are doing it for all of us, not for some of us. So that's the real psychedelic trip, that we don't turn our backs on each other. Right now, violations of drug laws are the leading cause for deportations. So this is really a call to action for everyone to join the migrant justice movement, the prison abolition movement. There are a lot of local communities organizing to address police violence at the local level. Things that folks can do is advocate for expungements, because expungements can be an avenue for people for a disruption and intervention of the incarceration to transfers to deportation pipelines. We should also be advocating for a decriminalization and legalization of all drugs founded on historical arguments of historical context. And I could ramble on, but I'll just pause for now so that we can hear from other panelists. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you so much, Paula. That was amazing. All right. At this time, I want to somehow transition from those incredible calls to action and that incredible historical, situation, how you had us so situated in these movements. I want to transition to kind of what's happening in communities that are practicing engagement with psychedelics as we speak today. And I'd like to hand it off to Aize. Before I do, I want to remind folks who are watching this live that if you have questions for our panelists, now would be a great time to ask, because after we hear from Aize, we're going to open it up for some questions and answers. So go ahead and post in the comments on wherever you're watching, and we look forward to checking out your questions. So Aize, I'd love to speak with you and hear from you about these issues where, healing journeys, and, we try to have maybe like protection and safety in terms of experiences where people are practicing, the therapeutic uses of these medicines and integration therapy and things like that. But achieving that goal of safety is sometimes nuanced and can be complex. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to how community healing contexts can practice being authentically inclusive of folks of marginalized identities in such a way that there isn't the replication or reproduction of trauma and harm based on those marginalized identities. I know you have a story to tell here, and I'd love to hear from you about that.
I promise I'm going to get to that story, but if I don't acknowledge Sister Paula's just dope ass connection between history and now, I would just be disingenuous in my approach. So first and foremost, thank you for that. And just to, draw a direct line to it, I see a lot of comments about, like, why is the government like trying to get into our business around our mental health, around our spiritual health, around, Black people, people of color, queer people in this country, this is our day to day. My father is Mutulu Shakur. He is a political prisoner. One of the things that he did before he was incarcerated was he brought acupuncture to the South Bronx and to Harlem. In bringing an acupuncture treatment for the treatment of heroin addiction, that's all that was the main thing. He was branded as a gang leader. So the history of policing bodies and mentalities and spiritualities and states of ecstasy, this is the common state of being for people of color in the US. So on one level, we're used to that, right? And it's like, it's new for some other folks, and, welcome to the struggle, appreciate it. But on the other side of it, what I've seen, and I've been doing this kind of work, sitting in groups underground for a while, and only recently I've come above ground because I really want to figure out through the Shakur Foundation, how do we make these medicines, these sacraments, accessible to more Black people? And why is it I'm the only Black person in so many sits? Why am I the only Black therapist in groups talking about psychedelics? Why am I the only Black theologian in, the Graduate Theological Union teaching on psychedelics? Well, why is that? Well, mostly because I don't see other Black people in the group, right? If you want Black people to do stuff, you got to see other Black people there. Being the only Black dude is cool sometimes, but sometimes it's annoying as hell. And so then it's like, well, why is there only one? And I think it's because there's some I'm going to tell a story. I want to preface the story by saying everybody is well-meaning in this story. Everybody is doing the best that they can in this story. But working in a community in Oakland that has a decriminalized status, there were people who went on a medicine journey. And they brought, it was surprisingly, not really, mostly white people, white straight folks. And they brought with them one Black queer man. They came back. I was an elder in the community at the time. I asked how the journey went, and they were like, well, there was a sexual predation that happened in this group. And I was like, oh, snap, that's crazy. Like, what happened? They're like, well, this person, made a sexual pass at someone else, and they felt somebody else up. And I was like, wow. And I was like, who was it? And it was the Black queer man. I'm going to tell you honestly from jump, when you have 5 white people go up to a journey and one Black queer man go up to the journey, and you come back down and say the Black queer man was a sexual predator, I'm questioning that from the beginning, because like Sister Paula says, if you don't have a context of the history of the racialization and the sexualization of the Black body, and you're doing this journey work with a Black person, there's something funny on that. But anyway, talk to the people. As an elder, I was like, I will help facilitate this conversation. And I talked to one of the people, and I said, hey, what went on? And they were like, well, this person, they said they wanted to sleep with me during the journey. I said, okay, what happened when you said no? And they said, I didn't say no. I said, okay. I said, did anything else happen? They said, well, they held my hand for too long. And I was like, okay, were they in medicine space? They're like, yeah. I'm like, okay, did you ask to get your hand back? They're like, no. I was like, did you get your hand back? They're like, yeah. I'm like, okay. So in my mind, I'm like, well, tell me where this, like, I'm really interested to hear where the violation is, right? I hear there's some miscommunication, but not necessarily violation. As this person continues to talk, and this is a white, heterosexual, cisgendered man, he was like, yeah, I was nervous, and I was letting a lot go. And I asked the Black gay man, he said, are you here to hurt me? Are you a predator? Are you an animal? Again, as a black male, my hackles go up, and I'm like, well, wow, that's really amazing. That would pull me out of medicine space right away. And they're like, really, why? So they had no understanding of the historical legacy and trauma that's going on. Again, I'm going to say it's very easy to point fingers at this person and be like, oh, this is a bad person. No, this is a person who really has best intent. Okay, this is not evil person, right? Talking to other folks in the journey, somebody was like, yeah, I was felt up, I was touched, So I go talk to the black queer male, and I was like, hey, how'd it go? I had a great time. It was good. Everybody learned a lot. We moved forward. It was awesome. And I was like, okay, I need to let you know what's being said right now. And the person's like, what the hell? Well, why wasn't this brought up during our integration session immediately after? It's like, I don't know. I'm like, well, why didn't they bring it up when we drove down from where we were? And the other person was telling me all these other compounds that I might want to try and might be interesting. I don't know. So I bring it up with a group. You know, what it is, you know, this Black queer man was awesome. He's like, look, there is a feeling that went on apparently that supposedly came from me that was not my intent. Apologies all around to everyone who's there. And what's going on with this feeling of sexual energy in the room, right? Like, and then someone else there was like, yeah, I didn't know what was going on. I thought all of you were going to start having sex, and so I left the room, right? So now we're seeing that the sexual content, the sexual energy that was originally located in the Black body was actually in this entire group. Okay, that there was a lot of things going on. It's really important to remember these are all good people doing the best that they can. But what it tells me is that if I'm going to be doing medicine with a group of people, I need to know that they've done their work, their race work. I need to know they've done their class work. I need to know they've done their sexual orientation work before I'm sitting in community with them. And that if we don't do that, then what you're actually doing, akin to what Sister Paula was saying, is we're perpetuating some of the same oppression that people are trying to fight against outside of the medicine space. You can look to the police, you can look to the federal government, and you can say, stop oppressing me. But then when you take the medicine, you can do the same thing to people of color. You can do the same thing to queer people. You can do the same thing to women. When I sit with people, for a variety of reasons. You know, one of the things that I always say with folks, you know, I'm like, hey, look, there's lots of different types of sits. If you want to go and have, you know, a sexualized sit, you're more than welcome to. I can point you to some of them if you want. But the sit that I'm having right now is not that. And if you're getting that energy from me, you let me know. And we'll do something to address that. We have to take these things and we have to make them conscious and public and out front. And like Deacon said, you can't assume that because someone is in medicine space or because someone does this work or because we like, you know, this person's bumper sticker, that they have done the work that makes a sit safe. So when we talk about protecting thyself, we're protecting it from outside of, you know, these communities, but also within the community. Like, how do community members do their own work ahead of time to make sure that any interracial sit, intercultural sit, intergendered sit, intersexual orientation sit is safe for everyone? Because what I'm seeing is a lot of psychedelic exceptionalism, which is that because there's, you know, this is in the psychedelic space for whatever reason, we don't have to look at those issues. We don't have to look at the war on drugs because these aren't drugs, these are sacraments. No, because they're connected, right? We don't have to look at race because, hey, we're all the same race. Okay, well, the scientific studies that were mentioned before, most of them were predicated on Black and brown bodies that were incarcerated or being used as test subjects. So all of this work is informed by people of color, queer people, poor people, and it's at the core of doing this labor. And if we're not doing that, I'm not really sure what we're doing.
Yes, thank you so much, Aize. Yeah, the need for explicit community covenants, community norms, and community agreements where people understand what they're signing up for is so important. And I really appreciate you using that story to highlight how these damages can be perpetuated when the work is not done in community with each other. Yes, so that was so powerful, y'all. Thank you so much. Okay. This is a time for us to open up to discussion with the audience. We've had some questions be selected here. We're going to actually work on culling and gathering some questions. So I'm going to first start just by a simple question, particularly to Aize and to Paula, which is, what are some tips that you have for communities to form agreements or to have covenants or things like that with each other to enable some of this protection, this practice of protection?
Yeah, I'm happy to share some thoughts around this. I think we all have to make, first and foremost, commitment within ourselves I think we have to commit to Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous rights, land rematriation. That has to be one of the fundamental frameworks from which we operate. I think we also have a moral obligation to our relatives of the African diaspora to reckon with the harms of the transatlantic enslaved trade. And we have to hold ourselves accountable by linking up with our local movements. And that's where we really begin. We begin by listening. And as Deacon had said, being observers. We need to be observers of history. We need to be observers of the present. And we need to link up with the folks on the front lines who are being met with state violence. And I feel like that's just praxis, you know, like who are the folks who are left most vulnerable by law enforcement and the criminal punishment system. So I think we also need to be operating from a place that values consent. Yeah, I'll pause there so that Ayuse can also share some thoughts here.
Yeah, I mean, should probably write this down at some point. I think the first and foremost is a willingness to be uncomfortable, to not just go the easy path when it comes to conversations around this work. I think it's also really important to see who is not in the room. You know, I've worked with folks doing legal policy, you know, doing educational policy, et cetera. And it's always astounding to me just like how, you know, homogeneous like these rooms are. And I'm like, hey, like who's not here? And like, where are their voices? So really getting that to be the norm. Kind of like, I think Deacon mentioned it too, sort of like a willingness to see what we're not seeing. Right? Like what don't we have expertise in this room, in this space, in this time? Where do we need to grow? And to push that angle of growth. I think that's another way that we can start sort of setting things up. I'm also more and more into this idea of like more community and less leaders. I'm getting a little cautious of some of the cults of personality that are out there around medicine work and around psychedelics, as you know, well, this person's been in it for da-da-da, so they know da-da-da-da, or this person's been trained by this person, and so da-da-da-da. You know, we all have our medicine. You know, we are the medicine. We are the best, like we are what we need to bring to the table. So the more we can acknowledge each other's awesomeness and specialness and knowledge and wisdom and skill, the better we're going to be. The more we start focusing on one person, you know, as having like a hierarchical sort of domination or da-da-da, I don't know. I just get cautious about that.
Nice. Travis, Deacon, Courtney, any comments on the topic of tips for safer practices in community healing contexts, or your favorite precautions that enhance safety? Go ahead.
Actually, there's a direct connection, I think, between something that Ayuse just said and something I just saw in the comments, which, so Ayuse was just noting that like we have this cult of personality thing where there's a disproportionate spread in between leadership and how many people, like once a person who's in any position of leadership has more than like a dozen or so people that they're leading, they're not in relationship anymore, you know? And then we get a lot of really negative dynamics. And even sometimes when people are in you know, leading small groups, there's negative dynamics, but they're different. And then I saw in the comments this, like, how do we stop these psychedelic retreats from being this luxury thing that's for, you know, a certain group of people? And I think the answer in both cases is the same. It's for people to step up, right? I think a lot of times we see this thing where, you know, people rail against hierarchy as though hierarchy itself was the problem, whereas it's like the intentions and the things that the dynamics of power that that are the problem, and that there's a whole lot to be said on that. But the solution, even whether you think hierarchy is the problem or the negative power dynamics of the problem, solution is for people to step up. Because what happens when the people who are in a position of leadership step back is that it leaves a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum, and predators step up. Predators are always there to gather the support of anyone who doesn't want to do the work. So the answer to not having these psychedelic retreats that are the exclusive way to access medicine is for whoever has the capacity to step into their power to lead. And it doesn't have to be like, and one of the things I just want to point out is that not all medicine, even of this type, is illegal. There's salvia divinorum, which I think in all but like maybe 1 or 2 states is illegal. There's deuterostramonium, which I don't necessarily recommend for everybody. That's like a heavy hitter. If you haven't done years of dream work, you shouldn't touch it. But like there are all these ways, and even just dream work, fasting. Like this is, again, hit the books, hit arrowhead.com and read people's stories and see what you can do, what you can practice, how you can level up, and how you can then become a leader in your community or just for your circle of friends. For a while in my shop, I had vets come to me just because I developed a reputation. Some vets would come to me and sit with me. And I can say this, salvia is perfectly legal. So we would do some salvia, and it would help some vets through some serious problems. And I'm not a therapist. It was just a thing that I did with a few vets I know that, they told a few of their vet friends. And so we would just do it every now and then. And it helped a lot. And that's not a big program. There were no retreats. We did it on my patio, just one guy and me at a time. That's leadership. And that's the kind of leadership that destroys the ability of these toxic personalities to gather this big cult, because people are getting their needs met by each other at this really small group level. And all we need for that to happen is for people to step into their power, level up, learn, hit the books, and do it.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. We're going to move on to a question now from the audience. This question is, what about having a personal belief that these medicines are a matter of religious freedom? Religious freedom, does this provide any protections at all? Courtney, maybe you have a thought about this.
Sure. So originating from the First Amendment freedom of religion, there was this basis where you are protected from the government interfering with your sincere religious practice. However, over the years, in the 60s and 70s, case law actually kind of turned the other way and said that generally applicable religiously neutral statutes, such as the Controlled Substances Act, it doesn't address religion, it applies to everyone no matter what religious belief you have, are not in violation of the Freedom of Establishment Clause. So in response to that case law, which actually enabled an employer in Oregon to fire 2 employees for having peyote in their system that stemmed from religious practice, Congress enacted the Religious Freedom of Restoration Act. And this is sort of a separate body of law from the Controlled Substances Act. And most states have adopted their own version similar to the Controlled Substances Act, where you can either get a DEA authorization by submitting a substantial amount of information on the sincerity of your religious practice, your kind of rituals, the controlled substances used in that practice, to get sort of an exemption from prosecution, which gives a lot of people pause, obviously, because there's no certainty that it will be granted. And now you have given the federal government all of the information you have on your activities. But it's also been able to be successfully used in as an affirmative defense to prosecution, which is probably more common. Now, the tricky part is that it's analyzed on a person and case specific basis. So you can't just affiliate yourself with a religious organization that has successfully used the Religious Freedom of Restoration Act in defense of controlled substances violations, but it would actually be analyzed specific to you and your activity in the event enforcement were to occur. And there are a number of different factors that the courts use in determining sincerity of religious belief, as well as whether the government's activity in enforcing the Controlled Substances Act against you is a substantial and unreasonable interference with your religious practice. So it's a lot more detailed and nuanced than just having a sincere religious belief and believing that use of a certain compound that is a controlled substance is an integral part of that religious practice. That's a big component, but it is important to understand and educate yourself on the limitations and scope of that religious freedom protection, as well as whether it applies at the state level, before you were to just go engaging in activities that are illegal on the basis that it is part of your religious practice. So it's definitely something, we can get into more detail on another time, but it is an available protection. It's just, it's inconsistently successful, and there's a lot of factors to consider before you would want to rely on that, and sort of without more understanding.
If I can chime in, just because I was working with Sacred Garden Community Church in Oakland, California, working on a slightly different angle than RFRA, and just to add that there are coming to be alliances of sacred plant churches and alliances of sacred plant churches that are joining together to figure out an alternative angle towards this, because that RFRA, the backlog on that is insane right now, and it seems to change from administration to administration as to who gets approved and why. And DEA really doesn't want to touch religion. So a lot of what is coming up right now is looking for actually theologians, religious leaders and whatever, to take a public stance on the role of entheogens in modern religious life, so that then legislators can look to that as argumentation one way or the other. So I'm just saying that in case there happen to be any religious leaders within the audience right now that are interested, you can reach out to me, and I'm happy to help connect you with some of those folks. I've been working with folks at Psychedelics Today that have been that had a conference for theologians, seminarians who are working with the concept of entheogens and how they might be applied to modern religious life.
Thank you. All right, we're going to move on to another question from the audience. This question is, any thoughts on the dangers that could emerge from legalization of these substances? I imagine that the dangers could be nuanced. It could be to our communities or to certain groups. So I'm curious if anyone has thoughts on dangers of legalization.
I'll touch on it just briefly and then leave it up to the rest of the panelists who have provided some really, really great practical information. But I do think, as we've discussed, that ensuring we get decriminalization first is critically important, or at least simultaneously, in protecting the disproportionate enforcement of drug laws against those less privileged, and then the community-based healing aspect, and ensuring that we are producing policy that is not just going to silo these substances into pharmaceutical lanes, that are not going to keep this top-down approach. And that's where legalization can get tricky, because when we're providing government-sanctioned access models as opposed to just removal of criminal penalties, we get in this scenario where where the federal government or state government can restrict access, and then we're providing scenarios where there's still a ton of different illegal activity. And so I think decriminalization is critical, and then ensuring that we are doing this from a community-based upward model as opposed to top-down approach is so important. So I'm so grateful to have everyone here that's working towards this, because aside from education and different indications that can happen with, having certain mental illnesses or drug, contraindications, really the biggest thing is preserving and protecting community access. I think, and a legalization structure is one of the biggest dangers we have without being very responsible and thoughtful about the policy that we're implementing.
Would anyone else like to speak on this question?
we've been able to kind of look at cannabis as an example of what not to do or what to do better. And with the community work that I'm involved in, we try and always keep equity, community, and integrity in the scope. And if it doesn't have those features, then we kind of just like, not disregard it, but de-emphasize it. And cannabis legalization, in my opinion, has made a lot of rich white people a lot wealthier, and there's no equity in that. So the cooperative project that I'm involved in shows that the community can handle the responsibility of stewarding these substances and distributing the incoming wealth that comes from the interface with the marketplace. So ultimately, legalization without decriminalization is just prohibition 2.0.
Thank you. All right. Not seeing. Oh, Pachamami, go ahead.
I'll add. Yeah, thank you. So I do think that unless we are consulting with Indigenous peoples and cooperating with whether they offer consent or do not offer consent, I think it's really important for us to be mindful of patterns of extractive behaviors that we can trace back for centuries and that are the foundation of this global economy. So I think we really have to be mindful of how, much like with cannabis, other psychoactive substances, entheogens can get co-opted by corporations, by folks who have access to venture capital, psychedelic entrepreneurs. There's so many racialized and gender disparities in who has access to venture capital. Just really being mindful of how the benefits might further reproduce disparities on a planetary scale. So we really have to bring in that abolitionist, feminist, indigenous rights, racial justice, historical memory frameworks into processes for decriminalization and legalization. Otherwise, we'll create barriers to access for folks who really need access to medicine.
Can I jump on if it's not too late? Just to be clear, we're already seeing it, right? We're already seeing, there's already a market in Canada for, there's an index in Canada for psychedelics to be investing in. And that money is looking for a place. I've heard that it's a $6 billion industry in the US already. So it's already here. What gives me hope is that I am seeing the psychedelic renaissance in some way, if it is a renaissance, being more like coding than it is, something else. Like, if you want a good coder, like go and find someone who's been coding for 10 years. You don't necessarily need to go find someone who's got a PhD in computer science. In fact, that person's probably going to be a bit left behind. It's the people that have actually been doing the work on a regular basis that we need to be talking to. I think there's a lot of programs that are coming out now for like certification for guides, let's say, speaking of that, like ecotourism or that BS tourism that's going on. And a lot of those certifications are replicating the same, medical apartheid and medical exclusionism that we're seeing in regular medical care, right? So for all these places that are being certified, how many of them have a cultural competency component? How many of them have people of color at the core of their work? How many people have women at the core of their work, right? We're not seeing that. We're not seeing those. We're just saying, oh, well, these people are going to be certifying folks in this spot, or there's this retreat down in this spot where you can go and get it at, right? But they're not addressing the core of humanity. I think the term marginalized identity was mentioned earlier. We're not marginalized identities. Our identities are our core. Right? What's being marginalized is our rights, right? And so how do we center the rights of people of color, of women, of queer people to have authentic and healthy experiences with these medicines, right? That's the question to be asked. It's not on the legalization issue is not a question of whether or not we should be legalized, right? The question is whether or not, how do our practices come into the light in a way that reflects the strength and the benefit of who we are as human beings and who we have been as human beings since the beginning of time. And I think if we reframe in that way, then it's less about having to justify our rights to exist and our rights to practice, and more like just making sure that our rights are solidified.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. We just have a few minutes left. And so we're going to move on to a final question that is going to each one of our panelists. We'd love to hear from each of you if you're willing to speak on it. Our final question is, what do you think psychedelic movements should prioritize in the next 2 years to build safety and liberation for all?
I'm happy to start since mine's quick and pretty much piggybacks off of my last response, which is community-based decriminalization at the local level, using grassroots organization, having more stakeholders at the table. When you're at the local level, it's easier to reach your government bodies. It's easier to have the right people at the table from diverse backgrounds. And by having that patchwork of decriminalization, which doesn't have the same teeth as state level decriminalization, we will get to state level decriminalization. But I believe that having community-based local measures in place first, and moving that along as quickly as possible, is critical to having a responsibly integrated decriminalization or regulatory system in the future. It's just, we need more people at the table, as everyone aptly mentioned, and we need people stepping forward and doing this now in their hometowns, where you can have access to the people that are making decisions in a more direct and authentic way than you would at these higher levels of government. And then again, like the ethics and the safe practice guidelines and education is so critical. So thank you for again hosting this dialogue, because it's been so informative to me. And just in learning, and so that we are able to do this from a place of understanding and responsibility, as opposed to just profiteering.
Yeah, I just want to echo everything that Courtney had said about acting on the local level, because those are your neighbors. Those are the people that you see on a regular basis. Those are the people that you can be in relation with when some of the bigger governmental structures seem a little bit more out of reach, out of touch, or they don't seem like they're listening. Most people don't know that there are 26 states out of 50 that a person can start a ballot initiative process. So I think it would behoove the movement to identify those areas where people can start the conversation, because when the conversation is started, those early adopters really do a great job of bringing out everybody that's laying in wait to participate in the bigger conversation. And if I've learned anything from being involved in the Denver process, is that there's enough people to support this stuff. We just have to get to them and activate them. I spent very, very, very little time convincing anybody of anything. It was just really getting the yeses to come out and participate. So I believe that if we just get to the people that are on our side of the fence and activate them, then the next horizons will become clear.
I'll jump in. Actually, I love how this question is worded. What do you see needed in the next 2 years that will ensure safety and liberation for all? Because the way the question's worded, it's not about the psychedelics, it's about the people. And I think that's actually one of the biggest keys is, don't center your movement on your medicine. The medicine's for you. And I recognize we're in a relationship. We have all these species that we're connected to, and we have this deep history. but focus not on the activities, focus not on the laws. Remember what serves what, and put everything in its proper sequence. I also saw in the comments, this thing about hitting the books, which has been reiterated. Hit the books, hit the books. We've said it a bunch of times, but also don't just study history. The history is huge. Study the history. So this is the thing, we have to hit the books hard, because you can't just study history. You have to study the method. There's some great texts out there about process, about what to do. There was a discussion on which breath work is meant. My answer is yes. All the names that came up, those are all important names. Look into them. It only takes, how long does it take just to do a quick dive down a little rabbit hole and see what's the difference between Wim Hof and the Yogi Publication Society's take on breath work? Maybe it's like 10 hours, maybe it'll be all night. That'll be a fun rabbit hole, right? Learn all the methods that apply to what you want. Get clear on your goals first. Read the history. Also read the books on method, and center on your community. There are some great books. I'm going to go ahead and plug a few just real quick. When you're centering on community, buddy of ours, Caroline and I, wrote this book. This is about, enhancing your community. There are books on developing better communities. This is one. Luby McNamara also just published one. I don't have it yet. And Abra Dresdale is publishing this one. This is a book about how to improve your community. So there's regenerative design for change makers, Change Here Now. These are about improving communities. Here's one that was published 3,000 years ago. It's a great one. This is about improving your community. Side by side, no contradictions between these. I got a bunch more. There are books on developing communities. There are websites and forums and blogs and conversations happening. If you get clear on what your priorities are and you put them in sequence, then you can just look them up and talk to people who seem to be succeeding in those areas. And just you do the research and you'll find the method that fits for you, because what doesn't resonate with you, you'll just move past. And there are no easy answers. Also, I just want to point that out. We could stay on this chat for another 3 hours and we wouldn't be able to just explain it all. Like I was saying, I did a 2-hour class just on those two network dynamic slides I had. I did a 2-hour class just on those two that's recorded in my archive. It's this stuff is not easy. That's why we haven't won yet. So don't beat yourself up about it either, about having not gotten there and not having a secure community, because this stuff is hard. The opposition is fierce and they get a lot out of winning. So cut yourself some slack, do it day by day, one step at a time, and that's it.
I didn't know we were plugging stuff, but since we are, and I'm joking. But I am teaching a class on at the Graduate Theological Union called The Sacred and the Substance. And the reason I call it that is because I talk about substance use, right? And substance use, from sugar to heroin to, whatever, that's a part of the human experience. And I think it's kind of, again, going back to the psychedelic exceptionalism, right? To talk about, this mushroom or that entheogen or that thing, it's kind of missing the forest for the trees, right? And what we can look at is how we engage with all substances, right, as human beings, and how we have in different cultures and in different times. And in doing that, we broaden this conversation out from this, what can be this very myopic sort of, granularly focused, which I think is important. I do believe in working at the local level, right? But we've got to expand this palette out so that we understand ourselves in the context of human history, right? And human culture, that we are all engaging in a variety of different substances to change the way that we are thinking on a regular basis. My joke is always, if you want to cripple France, take away their tobacco and their caffeine, and their wine. There's nothing they can do, right? They're done. They're done 2 seconds, right? So what are the substances that are utilized to keep a capitalist system going? A cigarette is a great invention. We created a workday around the concept of a 10-minute smoke break, right? So the difference between the cigarette and tobacco is vast and fascinating and really interesting. I have literally stopped people using cocaine by explaining to them the process of going from a coca leaf to cocaine. You cannot be a feminist. You cannot be for labor rights. You cannot be an ecologist and be doing cocaine at the same time. It's impossible. It wrecks all three, right? So how we talk about our substances, how we think about them, from the experience of taking the substance to the production of the substance, to the legality of the substance, all of those things are important. I think we have a great chance of doing a lot of legalization, because one of the most destructive and harmful substances to human psychology is 100% legal, and that's alcohol, right? I'm saying this as a drinker, okay? So it's not, right? We've got to make coalitions that we don't usually think of making, right? This is a genuine confusion for me. I do not understand why the broader psychedelic movement is not linked up with the harm reduction movement in a more sincere and honest way. I really don't get it, right? You want allies? Talk to the harm reduction movement. You want to see models for success? Talk to the harm reduction movement, right? So we've got to build a bigger table and invite more people to the table. But if we stay myopic, if we stay focused on our own little piece of the table, right? It's very easy to get us messed up. It's very easy to get us chopped up. So what I want to see for the next 2 years, the Black Power movement existed because of the Asian power movement, because of Latino power movement, right? Because of the movement to liberate Puerto Rico, right? Black Power didn't get anywhere until it allied itself with other movements. It's the exact same thing with psychedelics.
Yes, very much resonating with a need for building bridges between our movements. It is absolutely essential. I think we should be really focused on showing up for other movements and listening to those sharing testimony, testifying to the grievances that other movements exist to transform those grievances into a just and healing future for all. So with that also comes a lot of self-education and peer education. I think we're really, planting seeds for cultural shifts, paradigm shifts. And in order to do that, we really have to compassionately educate ourselves and other folks that are members of our communities that are still stuck in embodied trauma and in the normalization of the dehumanization of certain populations. So many of us are summoned to do that challenging spiritual work of communicating with those that have hard hearts and who have hardened minds around what people's rights are to freedom of movement. Right now, I really want to raise flags, warning people that we're actually perpetuating genocide under international law. And we really need to do more to abolish immigrant prisons and prisons in general. And ways that we can do that is by doing an analysis of how our local governments allocate public resources and linking with local movements that are doing that budgetary analysis. Here in California, for example, there are coalitions that are forming to build statewide power to shift California's budget from a budget that invests billions of dollars into mass incarceration and mass deportation and reinvesting those public resources in community-based systems of care, because we believe that the healing of each of us depends on the healing of all of us. So just really doing that coalition building work, and that looks like reaching out and introducing yourself to other folks that are carrying movements forward. So yeah, bridge building and peer education, doing that difficult work to advocate for those that are targeted by fundamentalist thinking.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. It's been an absolute joy and privilege to learn from you all today. Thank you all for being here, and thanks to everyone watching right now for joining us today. We're going to wrap it up here. But rest assured, this event is recorded and will be shared on our website, on our social media, and we'll be sure to highlight some of the amazing excerpts from this talk in our social media as well. So please keep posted, and make sure to join our mailing list and follow us. We're going to have more and more content like this on that theme of peer education and of dialogue. We're going to be doing more events like this in the future, so stay tuned and keep following SPORE. And thank you all so much for being here again. Have a beautiful rest of your day.